The quadratic formula. This is a formula that allows you to find the solutions of any equation. First, you learned about how to factor an equation to find the solutions. Let's review and let's look at this equation right here. We're going to factor and solve. The factors are -2 and -10. So let's write our two equations. So here's the equation. I solve for x, and x equals 2 and 10. Then you learn how to solve by completing the square. So we're going to take the same problem and we're going to solve it by completing the square. So we take the middle term, divide by 2 and square it, and we get 36. And remember, I have to add 36 to both sides. I get x squared minus 12x plus 36 equals 16. I'm going to subtract 16 from both sides. Then I get my equation. It looks just like this one. So you're going to factor, and you get the same answer. We've done these. This is what you've learned. You've learned about factoring and completing the square. Now let's talk about how we can solve by using the quadratic formula. This is what we can use to find solutions. Now, I know it looks overwhelming, but we're going to walk through it, and we're going to do it together. So let's take the same equation, and we need to write that in standard form so that the equation is set equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract the 20 from both sides. Here's the equation. Now we need to identify the a, b, and c. Well, what am I talking about? Let's look at the formula for a quadratic equation. Recall that this is the standard form of an equation. Before we can use a formula, we need to identify the a, b, and c. So we have a, b, and c. So the coefficient in the first term is 1. The coefficient in the second term is -12. And then the coefficient in the last term, or it's not a coefficient, but it's a constant, is 20. And we're going to take all of these numbers and we are going to plug them into this formula right here. So I'm going to substitute -12 where the negative b is. And don't forget there's a minus sign in front of that b, so make sure you put the minus sign in front of the -12. Now let's write what goes underneath the square root. So this is what we substituted for those variables in the equation. But don't forget to do the denominator, 2a. So here's the first step. I plug in all the numbers. I'm just substituting. I know it looks overwhelming, but you're just substituting a, b, and c into the equation. Let's take a look at the next step. I evaluate. The negative times the -12 is +12, plus or minus. Then have -12 gives me 144. And then -4 times 1 times 20 gives me 80. And then 2 times 1 gives me 2. So we simplify. I just wrote down the equation. Now let's go ahead and finish solving. 144 minus 80 is 64. Now look how there's a plus or minus sign. You can have a positive or a negative. Okay, scratch that. You set your equation positive, you put a positive, and then the other part you put a negative. Let me explain. So I'm going to write down 12 plus square root of 64 over 2. I guess I should write 8. And then you're going to find that solution. And then you write down 12 minus 8 divided by 2. So there are your two equations. Now you solve. 12 plus 8 divided by 2 is 10. And then 12 minus 8 divided by 2 is 2. And those are both of your solutions. It's the same thing as we did in the first part of the factoring completing the square. Now, I know you're thinking this is way too much work when I could have used either one of those other methods. Why can't I use that? Well, there's going to be problems that don't factor and they can't complete the square, so the quadratic formula comes in. So let's do another example with a different equation. Directions. Solve each equation, round to the nearest tenth if necessary. Always make sure that your equation is written in standard form. Identify A, B, and C. A equals 3, B equals 5, and C equals -12. So I'm going to take those numbers and I'm going to substitute them into the equation. So let's go ahead and write the numbers into the equation first. X equals negative, B is 5, plus or minus, B squared is 5 squared, minus 4 times 3 times -12. And all of that is 2 times 3. So when you're working this, if you can see that 5 squared is 25 and 2 times 3 is 6, you can go ahead and write that down. Oops. We have -5 plus or minus 25 plus 144. All of that divided by 6. I'm just doing computations right now. I substituted numbers and I put it into the equation, and I'm doing multiplying, add, and subtract. So once we simplify that, we have -5 plus or minus the square root of 169, all of that divided by 6. Then I separate my two equations. I have -5 plus square root of 169 is 13 divided by 6. And then I have -5 plus or minus, minus, change that to a negative, minus 13 divided by 6. And then you evaluate. So the first answer, sorry, you can't see that 6 on the bottom. So the first answer is 4/3, and the second one is -3. When you're not getting whole numbers, quadratic equation is the best way to solve quadratic equations. Let's do another one. So I have 10x squared minus 5x equals 25. Identify my variables. This is A, B, and C. Let's put those into the equation. Substitute. So I made a mistake. We have to go back and make sure that's written in standard form. So I need to erase all this. Subtract 25 from each side and we get 10x squared minus 5x minus 25 equals 0. Now let's plug in the numbers, substitute the numbers into the equation. This is A, B, and C. So x equals negative, don't forget the negative right here, -5 plus or minus b squared is -5 squared minus 4 times 10 times -25. All of that is over 2 times 10. All I'm doing is substituting numbers into the equation. Okay, let's continue. Simplify. 5 plus or minus square root 25 plus 100 divided by 20. Simplify that further. This should be 1,000. So we simplify that. Now we're going to write our two equations. So those are to the equation, the two equations. At this point, you can type that into your calculator. And my answer on this one will yield. This will be approximately 1 plus 1.9. Now, if you evaluate the next one, This one is approximately, we use that squiggly equal sign to show that we're rounding, -1 4/10. So my answers are -1 4/10 and then 1 9/10. Notice that that gives us decimals. We don't get whole numbers. This is why we use the quadratic formula. It works for any equation. If you think you've got it, then you can continue, move on to your work. But I'm going to do one more problem. Letter C, 4x squared minus 24x plus 35 equals 0. This is already written in standard form. So let's identify A, B, and C. A, B, and C. Now we're going to take those and we're going to substitute it into the quadratic formula. So I have x equals negative 24 plus or minus b squared, negative 24 squared, minus 4 times a is 4 and c is 35. And let's not forget about the denominator, 2 times 4. So now let's simplify. Minus negative 24 is 24, plus or minus 576 minus 560. All of that is divided by 8. Next step, let's split up our two equations and make two equations. The first equation is 24 plus or minus the square root of 16 divided by 8. The second one is 24. Oops. Change that right there. That should be 24 plus the square root of 16 divided by 8. And the next one will be 24 minus the square root of 16 divided by 8. We all know square root of 16 equals 4. So 24 plus 4 divided by 8 is approximately 3.5 or 3 5/10. And this one is approximately 2 5/10. All right. And that's using the quadratic formula. The more you do it, the more comfortable you'll be with it. All right. If you have any questions, make sure you see Mr. Jones or I on Monday and Wednesday tutorials. Don't forget. Show your work. You know the drill. All right. Bye and have fun doing quadratic formula.